My wife came through the door and said, "I'm scheduling a reversal. My ex wants a baby with me." Assuming I'd be the one up at night with bottles and bills, I answered, "Follow your heart." Then I filed for divorce and put protections on our shared funds, and her attorney rang me 2 hours after the surgery. My name is Jason Miller, and I truly believed our marriage, 13 years wed, 15 together, was poured in concrete, with no kids as our day one pact. 5 years and she had the procedure to make it permanent. I drove her to the clinic, nursed her through recovery, and we built a calm life. A condo facing a park, 2 trips a year, folders labeled early retirement. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. 3 Wednesdays ago at dinner. Pasta, tomato salad, the balcony floor doing its usual creak. Lauren twirled her fork, set it down, and said, "Blake messaged me. He wants a child with me." I said, "And you're telling me this because..." And she said, "Because I'm considering a reversal. I want to try." The fork stalled halfway to my plate. I said, "Come again," and she said, "He realized he made a mistake. We've been writing for a couple of months. He wants a family." I said, "You've been messaging your ex for months," and she added, "Just catching up, nothing physical." I asked, "So you want to leave me for Blake?" And she said, "No. Blake's between projects. He can't afford this alone, but we can. We could raise the child together." I waited for the punchline that never came and said, "You want me to help raise your ex's child?" And she said, "He'd be around, just not financially. More like a fun uncle who brings paints and guitars." I said, "A fun uncle who's also the biological father isn't an uncle. It's the father." And she brushed the air and said, "You're making it weird. Modern families look all kinds of ways. This could be beautiful. Blake is sensitive and artistic and would add different values." I said, "Lauren, we agreed on no kids. You had surgery to lock that in." And she said, "People change. I'm allowed to change my mind." I said, "You are, but you're not allowed to move another man's baby into our home and hand me the bill." And she said, "Our home, our money. We're married." That's when I understood my name was already typed into the pays for it column. So I said, "Follow your heart, Lauren." And she smiled and said, "So you'll consider it?" And I said, "No, I mean do what you want, and I'll do what I need to do." The next morning she was at the laptop before me, tabs for clinics, success rates, reviews, financing, and by lunch she had a private center quote for $9,000 and slid me the prepayment form saying, "They need your signature to lock the date." And I said, "I'm not paying for this." And she said, "It's joint money." And I said, "It's your project with Blake. I'm not financing it." An hour later her sister Megan called and said, "Are you blocking Lauren from medical care?" And I said, "This isn't chemotherapy. It's elective surgery to have another man's child." And she said, "She's your wife. You support each other." And I said, "Support doesn't mean pay," and agree. Lauren pulled a penalized loan from her retirement fund and fumed that I had forced it, while I retained an attorney, Daniel Grant, the slow-spoken kind who weighs words. And he said, "Get everything in writing. Ask her to confirm the plan plainly. You stay neutral." So that night I texted, "Just to confirm, your plan is to have a reversal to try for Blake's biological child, and you expect me to help raise and financially support that child in our home." And she replied, "Yes, we're a team. You told me to follow my heart." And I answered, "I'm not part of that plan." And she wrote, "Don't be cruel." The clinic booked her for Friday, fast for a private door, and on Thursday, she packed an overnight bag, humming, and said, "Blake's driving me in the morning. He wants to be there." And I said, "How noble." And she said, "Don't start. This is creating life. You'll love the child once they're here. You'll see." Friday I worked from home. At 9 a.m., after confirming she'd checked in, I executed the plan, filed for divorce on irreconcilable differences, placed temporary legal holds on joint accounts during proceedings, rerouted my salary to a separate account, canceled joint cards where I was primary, and updated beneficiaries so the paperwork matched reality. 2 hours later the phone lit up, unknown number, polished voice. "Mr. Miller, this is Alicia Cross. I represent your wife. What exactly did you just do?" And I said, "Filed for divorce and initiated standard asset protections during the case." And she said, "She's in recovery. You froze her access while she's in a hospital gown." And I said, "The timing is unfortunate. The decision was made when she chose to build a family with Blake on my dime. I have the texts if you'd like copies, and she paused and said, we'll be in touch. Controlling behavior is abuse, financial abuse, my body, my choice. Those were the slogans on Lauren's post, and the comments were split, her friends circling wagons while mine read between the lines, with my buddy Max, teeth dropping. Didn't she choose the path back to her ex? And the post vanishing minutes later after someone asked, wait, is this about Blake, the guy who ditched you for a 22-year-old? 2 weeks after the surgery, the legal war kicked off. She put Alicia Cross on retainer full-time, and they opened with a shopping list. 5 years of alimony, the house, half my retirement, reimbursement for the reversal, and future child support for children that do not exist. Daniel Grant actually chuckled, told me it was creative, and we countered with a clean break. Standard division, no alimony because she's employed, and she keeps her penalized loan, to which Alicia fired back with accusations of financial manipulation and reproductive coercion, which was rich considering she'd just had surgery to reproduce with someone else. Mediation got set for Thursday at 2 p.m. in our lawyer's conference room, and Lauren arrived with Blake in tow, declaring, he's here for emotional support, and the mediator asked, is there any legal reason for Mr. Harmon to attend? And she said, he's my partner now. And I asked, since when? Since I refused to bankroll another man's child. And Alicia said, my client was forced to seek support elsewhere when Mr. Miller withdrew all financial and emotional support. And I said, I withdrew support for funding another man's children. Small distinction. We looped for 2 hours while Lauren insisted she needed the house for the babies. And I asked, what babies? And she said, we're trying. They'll exist. And Blake nodded like a dashboard bobble until the mediator turned to her and said, Mrs. Miller, are you planning to have children with Mr. Harmon while seeking support from Mr. Miller? And Lauren said, children deserve support regardless of biology. And the mediator said, then perhaps Mr. Harmon should provide it. And Blake offered, I'm an artist. My work isn't about money, which landed exactly as you'd imagine. No agreement was reached, so Grant filed to expedite based on irreconcilable differences and abandonment of the marital covenant, while Lauren and Blake played house in my house because she'd moved him in after his roommate kicked him out for, rumor had it, not paying rent. And I paid the mortgage from my brother's spare room and got a neighbor's text saying, Blake is rearranging furniture. Thought you should know. Which meant my furniture in my house was being curated by the unemployed artist. Next came the restraining order gambit. She changed the locks on the place with only my name on the deed, bought before marriage, and when I showed up Saturday for clothes I got, you're not welcome here, bro, through the door from Blake. And when I said, it's my house, he answered, Lauren lives here. You abandoned her. And I said, I'm calling the police. And he said, do it. Tell them how you financially abused her. The officers arrived, looked tired, listened, and said, sir, it's a civil matter. Handle it in court. While Blake smirked in the doorway until Monday when Grant filed an emergency motion for exclusive use and the judge calendared it for Wednesday. Tuesday night, I got served. Lauren alleged harassment, threats to Blake, financial control, and that I was preventing her from starting a family. And Grant said it was textbook positioning to fix residence and paint me as the aggressor. Wednesday's hearing was a circus. Lauren wore a maternity dress, palm resting theatrically on a flat stomach, and Alicia argued, he's economically terrorizing a woman pursuing her maternal destiny, while Grant laid out the deed showing my sole ownership, texts, naming Blake and the baby plan, bank records of her $10K retirement loan, and the neighbor's footage of Blake moving in. The judge asked, Mrs. Miller, are you pregnant? And she said, not yet, hopefully soon, with Mr. Harmon's child. And the judge asked, while married to Mr. Miller? And she said, he abandoned me by refusing to raise another man's children. And after a silence, the court denied the restraining order, granted me exclusive residence, and gave them 48 hours to vacate. At which Lauren shouted, this is discrimination. I have rights. And the judge said, you have the right to pursue your relationship with Mr. Harmon elsewhere. Friday became moving day, and I hired off-duty officers. Best 400 I've spent. While Lauren and Blake rolled up with a rental truck at 8, plus her sister Megan, her mother Betty, and even Blake's mother, whom I'd never met, who arrived yelling, you're throwing my son into the street. And I said, your 38-year-old unemployed son who's sleeping with my wife. Yes, I'm clearly the villain. And as they hauled boxes, Lauren performed tears for the cameras, and Blake, tried to lift my flat screen until a cop stepped forward and said, "Sir, put the TV down." And he did. And then Megan insisted Lauren needed furniture for her new place, and I said, "Then she should buy some." And Megan said, "With what?" He froze everything. And I said, "She has a job, and your artist can figure it out." And Betty filmed, muttering, "This is what financial abuse looks like." Until Grant, who'd stopped by to observe, said, "Premarital asset. Here's the deed." And the real scene came when Lauren reached for my grandmother's dining set, and I said, "Absolutely not." And she said, "We chose it together." And I said, "I bought it at my grandmother's estate sale with my money." And she said, "I need it for the babies." And I said, "What babies? You just had surgery." And she said, "Future babies." And I said, "Blake's babies. There is no our here. There's you and Blake. Leave the furniture." And she sobbed, "You're cruel. I wasted 15 years on you." And I said it was a strange way to describe a marriage she was leaving to chase her ex. And Blake puffed his chest and said, "Show some respect." And I said, "You're literally taking my wife and trying to take my TV. Get out." And by 2, the truck rolled off half empty, because most of what they wanted was mine. And Lauren's parting shot was, "You'll regret this when you die alone." And I said, "Better than raising Blake's kids." 3 days later, the fallout arrived. They were camped at Megan's, and it was going badly. And Megan called sounding tired for the first time ever to say, "They need to borrow money." No, not for them. For my sanity. They need their own place. And I said no. And she said, "Blake won't look for work. Says he's processing trauma from the move. And Lauren is already picking baby names. She's not even pregnant. They're trying loudly in my guest room, and my kids are asking questions. And then, God, you're right. This is insane. What was she thinking?" Meanwhile, the divorce pressed forward. Alicia slowed her replies, and Lauren's asks turned desperate, including one deal where she'd take 50 cash and walk. And Grant said, "You could end this quickly." And I said, "She moved her ex into my house, changed my locks, and demanded I fund their future. She gets standard division, nothing extra." On Thursday, an unknown number pinged. Blake wrote, "We need to talk man to man." And I replied, "Pass." And he said, "I'm trying to be respectful here." And I said, "You're sleeping with my wife." Respect sailed. And he said, "She's divorcing you. She's not your wife?" And I said, "Still legally married." Genius. And he said, "I'll take care of her." And I asked, "With what money?" And he wrote, "Love doesn't need money." And I wrote, "Babies do. Just not from my wallet. Good luck." And he sent paragraphs about destiny and how I was blocking true love. And I answered, "You had your chance 16 years ago and picked someone younger. Now you're broke and shopping for a meal ticket." Lauren volunteered, "Not my problem." And he said, "You're bitter." And I said, "I'm realistic. Stop texting me," and blocked him. And Friday afternoon, Lauren showed up at my work. Security called me downstairs, and there she was, looking rough, hair unwashed, no makeup, the same clothes I'd seen 3 days earlier. And I said, "Lauren, we need to talk through lawyers only." And she said, "I'm pregnant." And my blood went cold for a beat, and I asked, "Already? It's been 3 weeks since the surgery." And she said, "The doctor said it was possible." And I said, "Congratulations. Blake must be thrilled." And she said, "He is, but we need help." And I said, "No, the baby would be innocent, but the responsibility would be Blake's." And she said, "You're really going to let a child suffer?" And I said, "I'm really going to let Blake handle his own child." And she started crying, the ugly kind, and security shifted on their feet while she said, "I made a mistake, several actually. I should have talked to you first." And I said, "You should have stayed faithful to our marriage." And she said, "We can work this out." And I said, "You're allegedly pregnant with Blake's baby and asking me to work it out." And she said, "You could be the father, like an adoption." And the security guard actually coughed to hide a laugh. And I said, "Lauren, go back to Megan's or wherever. Just go." And she said, "This isn't over." And I said, "Actually, it is." 2 months later, the divorce finalized, and here's where everyone landed. Asset division was standard 50-50 of marital assets. The house was my premarital property, but I bought out her share of the appreciation, worth it to get clean of the chaos. And she walked with about $73,000 total, not the windfall she expected, but not nothing. And the pregnancy was a lie. Megan confirmed Lauren got her period 2 weeks after that scene at my office. So she was never pregnant, just desperate. Blake lasted exactly 34 days after the decree, and when it sunk in, there was no house, No gravy train, no comfortable life. Just Lauren's $73,000 that was evaporating on deposits and furniture. He bounced, leaving a note that read, "Need to find myself. This isn't working. Sorry." And he took $5,000 she'd pulled for baby furniture for the non-existent baby and disappeared. And at 2 a.m. Lauren called me sobbing. He left me. And I said, "Okay, if that's all you needed to say, we're done." And she said, "What did you expect me to say? I gave up everything for him." And I said, "Yes, you did." And she said, "You must be happy." And I said, "I'm indifferent." And she said, "I want to come home." And I said, "That's not your home anymore. We had 15 good years and you threw them away for Blake." And she hung up. According to Megan, who texts me now and then, weirdly, we're okay. Lauren's in a one-bedroom, working overtime to keep the lights on. She tried the apps, but apparently telling dates she reversed sterilization to have her ex's babies isn't a great icebreaker. Who knew? And Blake posted on Instagram from Costa Rica last week. "Finding myself through art and adventure." With another woman, younger of course, and Betty Rang wants to guilt-trip me. She's struggling. And I said, "She's an adult who made choices." And Betty said, "She was confused." And I said, "She was calculating. It just didn't work out." And she asked, "Don't you feel anything?" And I said, "Relief." Which is true, because the house is peaceful now and I repainted, replaced the dining set she tried to take, got a promotion at work with no domestic circus kneecapping my performance, and started dating someone casually. Nothing serious. But she's never floated the idea that I should bankroll her ex-boyfriend's children, which is already an upgrade. The strangest touch was a Christmas card from Lauren. A photo of her beside a droopy apartment tree and inside, "Thinking of better times. Maybe new year, new chances." And I texted Megan, "Did she seriously send me a Christmas card?" And Megan said, "She's convinced you'll take her back eventually." And I asked, "Based on what?" And Megan said, "Delusion mostly. She keeps saying you two were meant to be." And I said, "We were meant to be until Blake texted." And Megan said, "She calls him the mistake now. The mistake that cost her everything." And I said, "She knows. Good." And the last I heard, Lauren was considering moving back to her hometown. Cheaper rent, and she could stay with her parents. And Betty would love that. She could brief Lauren daily on how evil I am while Lauren realizes Blake played her like a dollar store harmonica. As for me, life's good, quiet, drama-free. The way marriage was supposed to be before my wife decided her unemployed ex's genetic material was worth more than our life together and wanted me to raise Blake's kids. And she got to experience Blake's commitment level instead. And she wanted to follow her heart, and it led her straight to a one-bedroom apartment and a maxed-out credit card. And the entitlement was staggering. The assumption I'd just go along was insulting. And the shock when actual consequences arrived was priceless. And do I feel bad? Sometimes late at night, I remember the good times, and then I remember her across the table explaining how I'd be paying for Blake's offspring while he played weekend dad, and any sympathy evaporates. Because she made her choice and I made mine, and the difference is I can live with mine. While Blake is still finding himself in Costa Rica, and Lauren is finding out that starting over at 41 with nothing but debt and delusion isn't the romantic adventure she imagined. And me, I'm finding that peace and self-respect are worth more than any relationship built on entitlement and betrayal. And truly, best $73,000 I ever spent to get my life back. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.